Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Let me tell you a story. The year was 1980-something, near the start of the decade, and a new dance craze was sweeping the nation of Canada. And other nations, but my podcast co-host is from Canada, so let's focus our attention there. The dance was called pogoing, and it consisted of jumping around like a pogo stick, basically an early form of moshing. It started off at punk shows, but as post-punk and new wave grew in popularity, pogoing began to invade the dance clubs and discotheques. But not everyone was happy about it. Club owners and bouncers were concerned that people jumping and thrashing on their dance floors posed a danger to the people around them. Many clubs started kicking out pogo dancers in the name of safety, including one young man from Montreal named Ivan Doroschuk. Now, Ivan's story could have gone the same as so many other pogo dancers, drifting from club to club trying to find a place that would let him dance the way he wanted, but Ivan was different. Unbeknownst to the bouncers who kept throwing him out of clubs, he was the lead singer and songwriter for the synth-pop band Men Without Hats, and after a particularly bad experience, he decided to use his music as a platform to proudly declare his God-given right to dance. I think you know where I'm going with this. It's the safety dance. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this, with a groove laid down on an LM1, an early kind of drum sampling machine. Being played on a drum machine gives it this inhuman mechanical level of precision, both in timing and in tone. When a real drummer plays a part, there's always tiny fluctuations in rhythm, and each attack is at a slightly different velocity, angle, and position on the instrument. No two drum hits sound exactly the same. And to be fair, the LM1 was capable of reproducing at least some of that. Its swing feature is still legendary to this day, allowing enterprising producers to create all kinds of expressive micro-rhythms in their drum parts if they wanted to. But Men Without Hats doesn't seem to have wanted to. The timing here is precise and robotic like a metronome, and due to the samples used, every attack sounds exactly the same. At a time where synthesizers and samplers were just starting to get cheap enough to permeate mainstream musical culture, sounding like a human drummer wasn't really the goal. These new exciting technologies had their own distinctive characters, and leaning into that impossibly perfect automation gave the music a polished, futuristic sheen that spoke to the excess and optimism of the 80s. It may sound a little dated now, but at the time this was cutting-edge stuff, and there was no reason to try to hide it. Anyway, the kick drum sample is playing a 4-on-the-floor beat, hitting every quarter note at a relatively comfortable mid-range tempo of 100 beats per minute. It's not rushing and it's not dragging. It's just right for dancing, or importantly for this particular song, jumping. In between the kicks, we have a constant barrage of 16th note hi-hats. These serve to mark out the primary layer of syncopation for the song. For the most part, when they're doing things off-beat, they're doing them on the 16ths, so these hi-hats define the metric grid against which those attacks should be heard. It creates a densely packed rhythmic atmosphere even at a tempo that doesn't necessarily fill space completely on its own. But of course, the most iconic part of the drum sound in safety dance is the snare, which they drench in a frankly absurd amount of reverb. This creates a different kind of musical space, painting the picture of a giant, sprawling dance floor. But while it's echoey as hell, the snare sound is layered with a hand clap, so it's still really punchy, marking out clear points of emphasis within the sea of 16ths. Which, I mean, yes, that's what snare drums do, that's their whole job, but this particular snare is just so prominent in the mix that it seems to completely dominate the acoustic landscape. It's not a component of the drum beat. This snare is the drum beat. Everything else is just there to fill space around it. And just in case that wasn't clear enough already, the drum groove highlights the snare even further in the back half of each bar. If we just look at the first two beats, everything is pretty normal. We get a string of hi-hats, then a snare. Simple. Easy. I assume beat 4 is the same thing, right? Well, no. Instead of just letting the hit happen naturally, they set it up by playing an open hi-hat a 16th note before the beat, so not only is the snare an explosive event on its own, it's also the conclusion to the tension introduced by this rhythmic approach note. It's an extremely satisfying sense of musical closure that we get to experience in every single bar. Oh, and one last thing about the snare. In the intro, they ramp things up even further by panning it back and forth, so beat 2 sounds on the left and beat 4 comes from the right. They only do this in the intro to keep it from being too distracting once other things start happening, but it's yet another way the song tells you right from the very start that if you really want to understand what's happening, all you have to do is listen to the snare. And speaking of the intro, there's one other part that's there from the very beginning. The bass line, played I believe on a Roland SH2. Note-wise, it's just sitting on the root C, which allows you to focus all your attention on this really cool rhythm. The basic rhythmic unit here is a pair of 16th notes, followed by a 16th note rest. In every 2 beats, they try to play this unit 3 times, but there's not quite enough space, so they drop the rest off the end of the last one, giving it a sort of lurching, uneven feeling. This repeating pattern of 3-3-2 is called a tresillo, and if we just isolate the first attack of each group, it's really easy to hear. But they're not just playing the first attack, and that's kind of a huge deal. Specifically, it matters in the second group, where the added note falls squarely on beat 2. In a tresillo, part of the point is that the space is divided unevenly, but here, even if it's not the start of a group, there's still an attack happening directly in the middle. Because we're so used to hearing even beats, this flips the tresillo structure on its head, and to my ears, the more naturally accented member of this group is the second note, especially because it coincides with that massive snare hit. Taken together, we've got the wobbly, exciting unevenness of the tresillo while still holding on to the clear, consistent dancing groove of the straight-ahead beat. Again, really cool rhythm. And that's kinda it. I mean, I've got a lot more to talk about, but if I ended the video here after having only covered the drums and bass, you'd already have a pretty good understanding of what's happening in this song. These 2 parts are the heartbeat, the foundation, and as we go through, they remain the primary drivers of musical energy. They're also pretty consistent. The bass does change notes in some parts, and sometimes they switch up the drum sound as well, but Safety Dance is all about rhythms, and the rhythms don't change. Structurally, the song is built less out of sections and more out of layers. The bass and drums provide a rhythmic bed, and then they add 1 or more additional things on top, with the momentum coming from changes in what those extra layers are. Let's walk through those parts one at a time and see what each one contributes to the song. For the first 20 seconds or so, there's no top layer. All we get is bass and drums. I suppose you could argue that the panning of the snare drums is filling the role of the top layer here by providing some sort of contrast and motion, which, sure, let's go with that. But either way, they're introducing you to the basic form of the song before things start getting fancy. When we do get a new sound, it's Doroschuk spelling the name of the song with an echo set to repeat at 8th note intervals. This is actually a new rhythmic layer. We had hi-hats on 16ths, kicks on quarters, and snares on the backbeat, but nothing explicitly playing 8ths. Between the slower, more deliberate pacing, the vocal delivery, and the clear, predictable lyrics, this part feels like an announcement, declaring to anyone listening that the safety dance is about to begin and inviting you to join in and sing along. There's also a really interesting moment at the end where the 2-syllable word safety winds up interfering with its own echo.
Safety, dance.
I don't really know what, if anything, to read into this, but I thought it sounded cool. The next layer is perhaps the most iconic part of the whole song, the beeps. These are just octave Cs played on a Hohner clavinet. By sticking to just a single note played in multiple octaves, the line comes across less like a melody and more like a percussion part. If I swap out these notes for different drums, it sounds remarkably similar, especially because the actual part does line up with the drum pattern. The first high C in each group occurs at the same time as a snare hit, and much like the actual drum part, it starts by approaching beat 2 with a simple rhythm, in this case just straight 8ths, but then flips things around and approaches beat 4 with some 16th note syncopation. It's busier than the actual kick snare line, again engaging with that 8th note rhythmic layer that the drums and bass are leaving open, but the rhythmic structure clearly evokes the same ideas. It's just taking all the things in the drum part, like the big snares and the 16th note setups, and doing them more. Before we continue, I really want to highlight just how percussive this song is. We're about 40 seconds in, and we've yet to encounter anything that really needs to be analyzed harmonically or melodically. Some parts are playing notes, but none of them are about the notes. It's all about the rhythms, and that continues with our next layer, Doroschuk's vocals.
We can dance if we want to. We can leave your things behind.
Spoken vocals can convey a lot of different things, but here I think they communicate a theatrical sort of snark, like a DJ hyping up a crowded club. By leaving out the melody, he draws your attention to the lyrics, giving you explicit permission to dance. if you want to. It also adds a more human element. Everything we've heard so far, including the previous vocals, has been very synthetic and mechanical, but the way he reads these lines feel almost cartoonishly organic, standing in stark contrast to the musical surroundings. It reminds you that no matter how digital the sounds are, at the heart of it all is still a real person making music for fun. But even if the vocals don't have a melody, we do still have to finally talk about notes, because the bass part begins to outline a chord progression. Or, I mean, no one's actually playing the chords on top, so technically it's just a melody, but being in the bass part and changing in such predictable spots certainly implies a chord progression, so I'm gonna treat it like one. Here, we see another pattern of 3-3-2, with each group starting on either the 1 or the 4, the two most important chords in rock harmony. The first two groups end on flat 7, a flexible sound that works well as a bridge between our main chords, and the last group ends on 5, which serves as a little turnaround to set up the start of the next phrase. This simple, relatable approach to harmony lets you keep your attention focused squarely on the groove. After the vocals end, though, the bass takes center stage to play what I'm going to call the chorus progression. And suddenly we've got a lot more to talk about. What's happening here is still pretty easy to explain, but it's drawing from a very different musical vocabulary. Basically, we're on a journey of perfect fourths. We start on the 4 chord and go up a perfect fourth to the flat 7. We already saw this in the verse progression, where it just stepped up to the root, but here it keeps going in fourths, first hitting E flat, then finally A flat. Or, okay, technically the A flat is down a fifth, not up a fourth, but same thing. Or, okay, not quite the same thing, for reasons I'll mention in a minute, but for now, same thing. Point is, while this progression may take us to chords that fit in the key, it doesn't seem to be operating on the same tonal logic as the verse. There we saw some fairly traditional functional rock harmony, but here we're off on an adventure, stringing together these powerful harmonic intervals to pull us further and further away from the root and towards some more exciting minor key chords. But we also have to talk about register. Up to now, the bass has never gone above C. That's where it started, and so far it's been a hard ceiling. But here, in the chorus progression, it finally breaks through on the E flat, capping off the triumphant rise in fourths by reaching the highest note it'll hit all song. This is why the A flat going down does in fact matter. The rising line marks this section as important and exciting, but dropping back down at the end allows it to circle back around to the root, C, without feeling completely disconnected. It lets us smoothly return to our normal energy level with no obvious interruption. From there, we get another set of beeps, and then finally, over a minute in, our first real melody. It's a pretty simple one-bar looping phrase emphasizing G, the fifth of the key, with a quick walk down to E, the third, and then back up, but, E? That's weird, right? Everything we've heard from the bass part puts us pretty clearly in C minor. Shouldn't this be E flat? Well, I'm not actually sure I have all that much to say here beyond that, especially for rhythmically oriented songs like this one, strict tonality is a lot less important in popular music than most music theory classes will tell you. That's largely the influence of the blues, and while I wouldn't say this passage sounds particularly bluesy, the idea that we can blend major and minor sounds without conflict has so thoroughly permeated rock and pop music that I'd be willing to bet you didn't even notice this was wrong until I pointed it out. So why point it out? I don't know, it's one of those things that looks noteworthy on the page, and I think it's worth recognizing when the models we've learned make bad predictions. But if I'm being honest with myself, it doesn't really register when I listen to the song. Sorry if that's a cop-out, but it just doesn't feel unusual enough to require a more thorough explanation, so I'm gonna stop talking about it now. Next section, please.
We can dance if we want to. We can leave your friends behind.
That's more like it. Here, we see Doroschuk take the lyrics he was speaking earlier and reinterpret them with a melodic line from the synth. This starts by just repeating the line,
We can dance if we want to.
but now we have an actual chord progression to work with, so instead of a one-bar loop, he develops this into a full melodic phrase. This sticks mostly to chord tones, singing F over the B flat and F chords.
We can leave your friends behind.
In the second half, we've still got B flat and F chords, so the main melody sits on F, but he also adds a harmony line,
'Cause your friends don't dance, and if they don't dance, well,
which captures some of the motion between the two chords. And finally, he does a quick walk down the scale,
no friends of mine.
ending on D, the second of the key, which hangs tensely over the implied root. It's not a particularly adventurous melody, sticking mostly to the roots and fifths of the underlying harmony with a full range of a perfect fourth. But it's an effective melody, fleshing out that harmony and responding creatively to its musical surroundings. Rhythmically, it lines up pretty well with the bass pattern. It's not perfectly aligned, but whenever he syncopates, he's doing it to complement those groups of 2/16th notes we talked about earlier. Like in the first line,
We can dance if we want to.
this run of 4 consecutive notes is exactly matched with the bass rhythm underneath it, with the melody highlighting different parts of that rhythm to add nuance to the groove. From there, we move to the chorus, joined by Ivan Doroschuk's guitar. He's playing some cool minor pentatonic licks, but again, I want to focus on the rhythm. I know, I won't shut up about rhythm, but hey, it's a very rhythmic song. Anyway, this pattern is, again, pretty reminiscent of the bass part. In fact, the entire first beat matches it hit for hit. But unlike the bass part, the guitar skips beat 2, avoiding that big snare accent and leaning harder into the tresillo shape. Or maybe skip isn't the right word here. He doesn't just leave out that attack, he erases it entirely, moving the rest of the rhythm forward to compensate. That pulls the last pair of 16ths away from the next beat, leaving a gap that clearly separates the various statements of the riff instead of blurring them together like the bass does. By de-emphasizing the beats, this altered rhythm builds up a lot more rhythmic tension, which he releases at the end of each phrase with a blistering pentatonic run, playing the longest string of consecutive 16th notes we've heard so far, outside the drum part. Skipping the downbeat for this run makes it feel like it's popping up out of nowhere, but by sticking to a constant barrage of notes with no internal syncopation, it still serves as a satisfying resolution to the rhythmic dissonance of the main figure. The third verse is roughly the same as the second one, but with one small difference. The drums have finally changed. Here, the snare sounds flat and muted. They seem to have removed the hand clap layer, and the reverb is way less aggressive. This is an interesting choice to me. Typically, later verses will add new layers to build excitement, but here they're turning down the heat. Why? Well, I suppose you could read it as providing a bit of a break from the intensity of the previous sections, but I'm not convinced. On a casual listen, this change isn't particularly obvious to my ears, so the section doesn't feel relaxed. It seems to have just as much energy as the rest of the song. But I do have a better explanation. Removing the over-the-top snare doesn't really register for me, but bringing it back does. When we reach the chorus, the snare is right back to its old flamboyant self, so we get a free step up in energy without having to find a new sound. If they'd kept it the same through the verse, they'd have to crank it even higher for the same effect, but by subtly dropping it down, all they have to do is bring it back. Or actually, they do add one extra thing in the drums. Remember that open hi-hat they were using to set up beat 4? In the chorus, at the end of each phrase, they augment it with another hand clap. This is positioned right after the end of each vocal line, so let's take a quick detour and talk vocals. Doroschuk alternates between this sort of galloping backbeat rhythm in the first bar,
We can dance. We can dance.
and another fast barrage of 16th notes in the second.
Everything's out of control.
The exact structure of this second line depends on how many syllables are in the lyrics, but it always starts on beat 1 and ends a 16th before beat 3, handing the back half of the bar to the drums and turning that double snare into a clear call and response figure. It's also a moment of participation. By dropping out the vocals and highlighting the snare response, you as the audience are actively invited to clap along, a point that's further emphasized by the lyric "Everybody look at your hands." It all fits together to create a really fun communal experience on the dance floor, which is really what this song is all about. From there, we get what I would argue is our last essential layer, this new synth melody, played over a new bass line. Let's talk about the bass first. This is basically the inverse of the chorus progression. There, we went up in fourths, but here those fourths are going down, so instead of leading into minor territory, we're sticking to strong, stable major notes. There's still a perfect fifth snuck in there to change the register, but this time it's right in the middle, dividing the two halves cleanly so we can hear them moving in sequence. And the synth line follows that sequence as well, starting with this, then moving the whole figure up a whole step to match the bass. He even sticks an F sharp in there, which isn't in the key, but is necessary to maintain the precise shape of the original melody. That shape is pretty reminiscent of the original synth line, where it walks from G down to E and back up, and it has roughly the same rhythm. But here, it keeps going down, touching D, the fifth of the new chord, before bouncing back up to G. And it's also a little less aggressively syncopated to let it sit more comfortably underneath the vocals. And from there, we kinda start wrapping up. We've got all the parts, we just need to finish putting them together. This starts with a bit of a breakdown. They return to the intro with just the drums and bass. The panning is back on the snare, but this time they pan in 3 different directions, left, right, and center. They play this for 4 bars, so there's 8 snare hits total. They rotate as evenly as possible through the 3 panning directions, making another pattern of 3-3-2 like the bass, but way slower. That's pretty cute. Next, we get some more beeps, then the letters again, this time read by Anne Dussault. Then more beeps, a return to the initial synth melody, and finally a big siren-like riser to deliver us into the final verse. I'm glossing over the details of this section because we've seen most of them already, but structurally, it's really important. This runs for almost a minute, and while it's not doing anything especially new, it's still changing things up fairly regularly, creating different sonic environments to groove to. A song like Safety Dance isn't so much a story as it is a party, and this dance break is kinda the whole point. They've been building up to this all song, fulfilling Doroschuk's promise in the post-chorus that it is, in fact, safe to dance. Eventually, though, the vocals do come back in and close out the song. This starts with another verse that's pretty similar to the last one, and then another chorus. In the first chorus, we just had the bass line. In the second, we got Stefan's guitar. In the third, there was Ivan's vocals. So now, for the fourth and final one, the only logical decision is to combine all of those and play the vocals and guitar at the same time. We can dance, everything's out of control. This puts that guitar run in the perfect spot to respond to the vocals, joining forces with the double hit snare to really drive home the end of each phrase. It's like these parts were made for each other, which, yeah, they were. Then we get another post-chorus and finally end by bringing back that initial synth figure one last time, accompanied by more of those siren risers, until we close on an eruption of claps. And that's pretty much it. Honestly, I expected the song to be a lot easier to break down, but as is so often the case, a song that seemed simple actually had quite a bit going on underneath the surface. These sorts of dance songs have an almost fractal nature to them. Viewed from a distance, the pattern looks simple, just some bass and drum rhythms dressed up all fancy, but the closer you zoom in, the more there is to see. I really wish I'd been able to find the studio stem tracks for this one, because I'm sure there's things going on that I didn't even hear, but even with what I was able to pick out of the mix myself, it's clear that a lot of love and care went into crafting this song, and I appreciate it way more than I did when I started this journey. I hope you do too. Now get out there and dance. Anyway, this is where I'd normally put a sponsor section, but as regular viewers know, I've been trying not to do those anymore. Since the start of the year, I decided to experiment with relying completely on ads and Patreon to let me spend as much time as possible making the actual videos instead of having to figure out how to sell you someone else's product. And so far, in a lot of ways, it's been going great. I'm really proud of the work I've done this year, and I hope you've seen the same increase in quality that I've felt. I've developed a much healthier work-life balance while still being able to invest myself full time into making the best videos I know how to make. But in order to sustain that long term, I need your help. These videos take a really long time to make, and I do have to pay my bills somehow. I used to do those primarily with sponsorships, so cutting those out means losing a lot of my income. YouTube ad rates are really low right now, so I've been relying pretty heavily on Patreon support to fill that gap. If you like my work and you can spare a couple dollars a month to help me keep making it, I'd really appreciate if you'd consider checking out my Patreon. There's a link in the description. If not though, don't worry. I always try to stress that no one owes me money for 12-tone. I made the decision to publish this for free because it's important to me that educational materials aren't hidden behind a paywall, so if you can't afford to pledge or you just don't want to, that's totally fine. I'm glad my videos are available to you, and I'm glad you think they're worth your time. But if you can support, and you want to, then not only will you be helping keep 12-Tone available for everyone, you'll also get to help us choose which songs we make videos about. I was honestly pretty surprised my patrons chose this one, but I'm glad they did because it was a really fun challenge. Anyway, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sungard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Kevin Wilamowski, Grant Aldonas, and Damian Fuller-Sutherland. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.